Most of what I'm drawing from is from the Virginia Herald of November 1824. And in fact, that's the source that Rufus Merchant reproduced in his pamphlet, which we were all reading in planning this whole thing. And we didn't know when he published that, and we didn't know where he got that information from. But I ran across it in this book, Lafayette, Guest of the Nation, a contemporary account of the triumphal tour of General Lafayette through the United States in 1824, 1825, as reported by the local newspapers, volume 3. And I got this out of the University of Mary Washington Library. And so, and I found when I got into it, I found this is exactly where the text that Rufus Merchant published came from. So we didn't know that before. We knew it was decades later that he published it, but in fact, what he published was an account written at the time, by the Virginia Herald in 1824, in November of 1824, when Lafayette was here. So that's one of our sources, one of my sources for today. Another one is Lafayette Day by Day, Lafayette in America Day by Day. And I think I have one more here. Yeah, the Marquis de Lafayette in the American Revolution. These are all books I picked up at the University of Mary Washington Library. And then there's also, one of the most valuable ones was when Lafayette came, he brought with him Auguste Levasseur, who was his personal secretary. And Levasseur was with him every day for the 14 months that he was here, and wrote every day about Lafayette's visits and what happened. And so that's available online through the Gutenberg Project. And one can just look that up, look up Levasseur, Lafayette in America, 1824 to 1825. So if you're not yet aware of it, Lafayette's return was not just a matter of a few days here in Fredericksburg, as part of the 14-month-long visit, during which he visited all 24 states of the Union. And the visit began in New York, and it took him thousands of miles. And this is 1824. I mean, 1824, traveling thousands of miles from New York through to Mississippi to, all around the whole eastern half of what is now the country. It's hard to imagine what that could have been like. He traveled by horse-drawn carriage. He traveled by steamboat. We know, for example, that that's what this slide is about, that it took his group, his party, an hour and a half to get from Wilderness Tavern, which is pretty much the intersection of Route 3 and Route 20, an hour and a half to get there from there to here. And it wasn't because of traffic. It was, it's because he was in a horse-drawn carriage, and if it takes you that long to get from Wilderness to here, and you're traveling thousands of miles around the United States, I mean, what an experience, what a trip that must have been for him. He was 67 years old, and I don't think those carriages could have been that comfortable, and they certainly weren't air conditioned. And it started in August of 24 and went through, for 14 months till I guess November of 25, October of 25. He was accompanied on his tour by his son, George Washington Lafayette, and George was 45 at the time. Lafayette himself was 67. And he was also accompanied by Auguste Levasseur, as I mentioned, and two wealthy Scottish sisters who were admirers of him and of the United States, and who came from Scotland to visit him in Lagrange in France a couple of years before he came. Their names are Fanny and Camilla Wright, and they were in their late 20s. And I don't know much, nobody knows much about their relationship, but they were very interested in Lafayette, and I imagine he was pretty interested in them too. they did not travel with him to the United States because that seemed unseemly, but they met up with him in the United States, and they traveled with him quite a bit. But then they backed out of his tour when it got to the southern states because they were appalled by what they were seeing in the southern states, and they did not accompany him to Fredericksburg. Now, at the outset, it was not his intention to do a 14-month visit to the United States. He intended to come for about 4 months and just stay on the eastern seaboard. But when he got here, he went to Boston fairly early, and he was told in Boston, well, we're going to do a 50th anniversary celebration of the Battle of Bunker Hill next year. So if you're around, we'd love for you to be here. And he decided, well, hell, I'm staying around. I'll stick around. So he changed his mind and he decided to turn it into a 14-month stay in the United States. Mike Duncan says, quotes, I have this quote from Mike Duncan's book, Hero of Two Worlds, that since Lafayette was the last living Continental Army general, he replied that if he should then be in the United States, it would be his earnest desire to be present. And then he changed his plan so that he would indeed be present. And he made it back into Boston in time for that celebration. So I wanted to give a little bit of background on Lafayette too before I get into his visit to Fredericksburg. It was 40 years later. It was 40 years since his last visit to America. He went back to France in 1784. And he came back here in 1824. So 40 years of his life, most of his life, because he came here when he was 19. He went home when he was 25. He came back here when he was 67. So most of his life was spent in between. And in 1777, when he first came here, he was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. His mother and father had both passed. I think by the time he was 15, he was an orphan, and he had an enormous amount of money. I mean, he was so wealthy, and that was one reason why he was able to come to America when he did, because the king didn't want him coming to America, so he just went to Bordeaux and bought a ship, and paid a crew. And came to America. I'm sure it wasn't as simple as that, but nonetheless, he had the funds to just fund himself to come to the United States. He didn't need the king's support to do it. And he took quite a risk, in fact, in doing that, because the king wasn't that happy with him doing that. But things worked out in the long run. Anyway, 15 years later, in 1792, when he's back in France after the French Revolution turned sour, his life was completely different. I'm quoting from Spalding's essay in Symbol of Two Worlds. Quote, beyond seeing his dreams broken, I think I may even have that on the slide. Wait a minute, there we go. Beyond seeing his dreams broken, meaning that the French Revolution did not do what he hoped it would do. It did not turn France into the kind of country that he hoped it would turn it into. He suffered defamation, seizure of his property, loss of friends and relatives, brutal mistreatment of his wife, and his own incarceration for over 5 years as a prisoner of state by the radical Jacobin government. I mean, he went from being one of the wealthiest people in Europe to poverty and to imprisonment for 7 years. He was in prison in Austria for 7 years. In Austria, because when he fled France in order to get away from the circumstances that had developed there. So he had 3 children after returning to France in 1784, and when he was arrested in Austria, his wife Adrienne had their youngest son, who he had named George Washington Lafayette. And she sent him to America. He was 15 years old. And she sent him to Washington, to George. And he went to Harvard, and he studied there, and he lived at Mount Vernon with George. While Adrienne and their 2 daughters spent 2 years in Austria, in prison, with Lafayette. They were released in 1797, but they were forbidden to return to France at the time on threat of execution. And they were living in debt, and they were living in rented properties in Holland. So the circumstances of his life are remarkable. I mean, to have gone from such a pinnacle of success and stature to that. But by 1799, he was back in the Parisian area, and he eventually got elected to the Chambre des Députés, the Chamber of Deputies. And he was living at the some of the family property was restored to him, and 50 miles south of Paris is the estate known as La Grange, where they moved in 1800. But according to Mike Duncan, again, it was they had to replace the roofs, they had to restore the interior rooms and the grounds. It was a shambles. At one point, he was offered by Bonaparte. He was offered the position of French ambassador to the U.S. And he refused it because he didn't like what Bonaparte was doing. He didn't like Bonaparte's government. It was too authoritarian. And then a few years later, after Bonaparte sold Louisiana to the United States, Jefferson offered him the role of territorial governor. Do you want to come to the United States and be the territorial governor of Louisiana? And he said, no, I'm not going to do it because Adrienne, his wife, was not in good health. And he wanted to stay in France and work for political change. But then in 1807, Adrienne died. And that was after 34 years of marriage. He was 50 at that time. He had a dozen grandchildren at the time. And he wrote to Jefferson. He said, before this blow, I confess, I did not know what it was to be unhappy. Now I feel myself irresistibly overpowered. So he largely lived a life of retirement at La Grange, but he remained focused on his political ideals and the failure of the post-revolutionary French government to follow the model of American democracy. By 1820, he had come to the conclusion that working within the political system was not going to come to positive outcomes, and he was actually working with a network of conspirators to overthrow the government. In 1822, the government maneuvered him out of the Chamber of Deputies, and Mike Duncan writes the following. When James Monroe wrote to him and invited him to come to the United States, Duncan says, when he received this letter, he surveyed the climate in France and concluded that a long vacation in America was just what he needed. It was time to get out of the stifling conservative atmosphere and go back to where people loved him and celebrated his ideals. Time to go back to return to America. So now we can shift gears to our real theme. I just think, I myself did not know as much about Lafayette 3 months ago as I do now, and I figured probably most of you have not been reading up on Lafayette as much as I have, so I thought I would share some of that background. First thing I want to say, and it was on the slide indicated earlier that from the Washington Heritage slides. When he came here in 1824, it was a return. It was a return to Fredericksburg. It was not his first visit. In the, let's see, I can put that up, yeah. In the book called The Marquis de Lafayette and the American Revolution, we can see he wrote a letter to George Washington near the end of the war in 1781, in which he explains that rather than riding back to, he was in the Williamsburg area. He was supposed to go back and see Washington in Annapolis, and he says he took a detour because he wanted to go to Fredericksburg and see Washington's mother. And that's what this map is actually in this book that I picked up at Mary Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette in the American Revolution. This map showed the red line to the left there is the route he took. And he rode at night on a horse. He writes to Washington, I wrote at night to make up for the lost time because I know you didn't want me to do that. You wanted me to go directly to Annapolis, but I wanted to stop in Fredericksburg to see your mother. And I wanted to go see Mount Vernon. So he said he rode at night to make up. Can you imagine riding on a horse at night in 1781 from Williamsburg to Fredericksburg? How would you even know where you were going? I don't know. I don't know how you could even do that. But I photographed the text, and he says, I confess I could not resist the ardent desire I had of seeing your relations and above all your mother at Fredericksburg. For that purpose, I went some miles, out of my way, and in order to conciliate my private happiness to duties of a public nature, I recovered by riding in the night those few hours which I had consecrated to my satisfaction. The language is incredible, isn't it? I mean, the few hours I had consecrated to my satisfaction. I also had the pleasure of seeing Mount Vernon and was very unhappy that my duty and my anxiety for the execution of your orders prevented my paying a visit to Mr. Custis. I can't comment on the Mr. Custis thing. I'm not sure who that Mr. Custis is exactly, because Martha's father was already dead, so it was stepson. Okay, thanks. So a few months after his arrival in New York, he was in Yorktown, Richmond, and Charlottesville, and he spent a few days with Jefferson, who gave him a tour of the new university just a few months before it was to open. And I just want to recount one anecdote from Levasseur's account of his visit to Charlottesville. I think I had that too on slide. No, I do not. Levasseur, his secretary, writes, before taking leave of the youth of Charlottesville and its respectable professors, one of the latter took us into a little hall where he showed us a rattlesnake moving at freedom upon the floor. It was caught a few days previous in the woods and was intended as a present for Mr. George Lafayette, who had expressed a desire to obtain one. We contemplated with pleasure this dangerous reptile, whose piercing eye, supple movements, livid body, crossed by broad black bands and sounding tail, would doubtless have inspired sentiments of another nature if we had not known that his venom had been rendered harmless by the extraction of the cannulated fangs, through whose instrumentality, the sentence goes on and on and on, through whose instrumentality this animal so subtly introduces its poison into the veins of the victims it strikes. The poison of the rattlesnake is so violent that it is said frequently to produce death in less than half an hour. So when you read these accounts from 1824, this is how they all write. You know, I mean, these sentences go on for, days. Interestingly, Lafayette dined with Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and 396 other guests in the upper room of the Rotunda at Virginia, at the university, in Charlottesville. And I didn't write down the quote about, but they just quote on how wonderful all the meats were, is what the. Now, one of the really saving virtues of Lafayette, he really did believe in equality, and he was insistent on that. It put him at odds, in fact, with Madison and Monroe and Washington and Jefferson, who were all slaveholders. From Monticello, his party traveled to Montpelier, Madison's home, and as happened at many of his stops, the topic of slavery and the contradiction between America's ideals and its practices came up for discussion. And it was a topic that he frequently brought up. And I'm going to show you a lengthy passage from Levasseur. It's Levasseur writing this, not Lafayette. But when I read this, I thought, if there's any book this reminds me of, it's Marx's Capital. This analysis sounds just like Marx in Capital. and actually, that's only the second half of the passage I'm going to read you. Here's the beginning of it. The plantation surrounding Mr. Jefferson's dwelling consists of several thousand acres, but not more than 12 or 1,400 are cultivated. Cultivation must be very expensive and consequently leave very little profit to the proprietor. Like all the planters of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson employs slaves to do his work. That is to say, if he requires the labor of 50 Negroes, he must feed, lodge, and clothe 100. For if from this number of slaves we subtract the old men, the children, the weak and sickly, and the women, not more than 50 individuals are in working condition. After all, it may be added that these 50 active individuals do not affect more than would be accomplished by 30 free men hired by the day. And here's where the quote picks up. From these considerations, we may boldly conclude that 30 free laborers paid by the day would do the work of 100 slaves, which the owner is obliged to feed and clothe throughout the year in order to have 50 laborers. I suppose that the support of each slave costs but 1 franc a day, and the hire of a laborer would be 3. There would then be a difference of 10% a day in the labor in favor of cultivation by free hands. This difference does not appear at first very considerable, but if we take into account the enormous capital of $50,000 at least for the purchase of the slaves, the 52 Sundays and other holidays during which nothing is paid to the free laborer, and during which the slaves eat, although they do not work, we shall then find that the difference is still greater, and shall scarcely comprehend why a planter should not make his best effort to substitute the labor of free men for that of slaves. So these are the kind of conversations Lafayette was having with Madison and Monroe and Jefferson. And of course, that's not to mention the fact, which will be covered by other talks, that the project he undertook in Haiti or in Dominican Republic to have slaves freed and run their own businesses. Levasseur goes on to say, Lafayette never missed an opportunity to defend the right which all men have without exception to liberty, broached among the friends of Mr. Madison the question of slavery. It was approached and discussed by them frankly and in a manner to confirm me in the opinion I had previously formed concerning the noble sentiments of the majority of Virginians upon this deplorable circumstance. Levasseur continues, it appears to me that slavery cannot exist a long time in Virginia because all enlightened men condemn the principle of it. And when public opinion condemns a principle, its consequences cannot long continue to subsist. Well, wish that was true. And then after, Levasseur goes on to say, after the question of personal slavery, the question of spiritual slavery was one that Madison's associates liked to bring up. And what he means by that is, here in America, we have freedom of religion. We're not forced to have a particular religious view, whereas in Europe, you have tolerance of religious difference, but here we have freedom of religion. And he says, the friends of Mr. Madison congratulated themselves that at least this sort of slavery was unknown in their beloved country. So, okay, we have real slavery, but at least we don't have spiritual slavery. And I wanted to include that passage because it makes it clear that in 1824, Americans were proud to say that we have freedom of religion. There is a clear separation of church and state. Levasseur recounts that when Lafayette left Montpelier on November 19th on his way to Fredericksburg, and it's charming, he spells Fredericksburg with an H at the end, like Pittsburgh, you know. I mean, start putting an H on Fredericksburg. Yeah, the party stopped at the courthouse in Orange and was greeted by a large gathering, escorted to the home of Colonel Barber, who was the ex-governor of Virginia. And they had a huge dinner at Barber's home, and the ex-governor oversaw 13 official toasts during the dessert. Then leaving Orange at a short distance, says Levasseur, so we don't know for sure how far from Orange it was, but I'm assuming it must have been along what we would now call Route 20. they met a large collection of people assembled around a triumphal arch erected at the intersection of the road with a narrow path through the woods. This path had been opened up by Lafayette on June 15th, 1781, so that his troops could make a rapid march from the banks of the Rapidan River to Michunk Creek and cut off Cornwallis from reaching Albemarle, where provisions and weapons were stored. And that road is now called the Marquis Road. And this mark, I went out there and saw this a couple of weeks ago. It seems pretty likely that this would, from my, I can't confirm this. I'm speculating that this may have been what's now Route 669, just south of Route 20 at Unionville. And the funny thing is, I've driven by there dozens and dozens of times. I've never seen a sign that said Marquis Road, because where it intersects Route 20, it's called Gospel Hill Road. But if you go a mile south, it's called the Marquis Road. So you ride right by, you drive right by the Marquis Road, and you don't know it's the Marquis Road because the name is Gospel Hill Road where it hits Route 20. So here's a couple of other photographs I took of that area. Here's the Marquis Road at the intersection of Independence Drive. Here's the Lafayette Trail right down the road from there. So in his account of this encounter with people at this triumphal arch in just east of Orange, Levasseur points out that Lafayette was always known as the Marquis during the Revolutionary War. And he goes on for a little bit about that, which is interesting. That in 1781, he had made a speech to his troops, many of whom were local farmers who had given up their crops in order to fight with him. And he told them, "I've had you too long. You should have been relieved by now. If you want to leave and go home, you can, you should." And the response of the fighters was, "No one's going to leave the Marquis. You know, the Marquis, no, what wretch would abandon the Marquis at this point?" And Levasseur goes on to say that even when Lafayette came back in 1824, he was still being called the Marquis in the newspapers in New York in 1824, and they only stopped calling him that when they learned that he had renounced the title 35 years earlier at the National Assembly in France. And Levasseur concludes the passage saying the Americans in general just didn't want to stop calling him the Marquis because it was an old custom and they thought it was charming, and it made them think of the Revolution. And so they wanted to keep calling him the Marquis. Now here's what, do I have this one here? Levasseur writes this: "We had advanced but a little way from Orange when we discovered a great crowd collected about a triumphal arch erected at the intersection of the road and a narrow path scarcely to be distinguished from the thickness of the wood. We soon learned that this path, over which young females were strewing flowers, and which the crowd passed over with such touching interest, was the road opened up by Lafayette on the 15th of June, 1781, in order to make a forced march from the banks of the Rapidan to Michunk Creek, where Cornwallis was much astonished to find him prepared for battle. At the moment he thought he might seize without resistance upon the magazines of the Middle States established at Albemarle. This new proof of the honorable recollection in which the Americans held all his actions deeply affected Lafayette. He was moved almost to tears when he was covered with flowers by the young ladies, when in descending from his carriage he found himself surrounded and tenderly embraced by the citizens who awaited him under the triumphal arch. He conversed a long time with them and related to the young people how strongly these places reminded him of the obligations he owed to their parents." So this is 1824, and they're remembering what he did in 1781, and they're celebrating that with him. And here's what Lafayette said, Levasseur recounts. "It was here," said he, "at the moment when I effected by this path a movement which would have been so fatal if unsuccessful, that they abandoned their harvests to join my little army. And during that whole campaign, the separation from their families, fatigues of every description, the ruinous abandonment of agriculture, and the difficulty of procuring provisions did not prevent them from remaining with the army far beyond the time we had any right to ask of them." And so that evening, apparently, Lafayette stayed at Wilderness Tavern, and it was not until the next day that they departed for Fredericksburg. This is a passage from another text. This is just, I photographed this so you can see what a wonderful reproduction it is. About 8 lines down, the men of Virginia knew every creek and path of the country. They found a disused road which was generally deemed impassable. Happily, it proved to be pervious, though inhospitable. Don't you love the language? Jeez. Lafayette forced his men through in quick time. Long afterward, it continued to be known as the Marquis Road. On the way, the light infantry in Lafayette's army were cheered by the arrival of their new shirts from Baltimore. Because, I mean, the conditions, the clothing, you remember, you've heard of what happened at Valley Forge. I mean, the conditions that the people fighting at the time were living under were unbelievable. So it was not until sunset, and I'm quoting again from Levasseur, it was not until sunset on the 20th of November that we arrived in Fredericksburg, with an H, where the general was received by the little boys formed into a battalion under the name of Lafayette Cadets. The night was already dark and the town glittered with illumination when we arrived at the place where the mayor pronounced his welcome. A splendid supper and a ball in which all the ladies of Fredericksburg were present terminated the day. Next day, being Sunday, we went to the Episcopal Church, escorted by the Freemasons in grand ceremony. The clergyman who officiated was a member of the lodge. On Monday, we passed part of the day with Captain Lewis, a nephew of General Washington, and in the evening we set out for Washington, accompanied for several miles by the inhabitants of Fredericksburg. At the Stafford County line, the extremity of which we crossed, the militia met the general to escort him to the Potomac, where a vessel awaited us, and we conveyed us to Washington by a pleasant night voyage. That's Levasseur's very concise account of the visit to Fredericksburg, but I have some other details I picked up from the Virginia Herald that I can share with you. The Herald reports that they arrived from Wilderness Tavern at the parade grounds on the outskirts of the city. Now, I don't have a map from 1824. This map is from 1860 something. I got this at the Virginiana room here in the library. And this shows you, the city ended basically at Prince Edward Street. And the fairgrounds here, which is adjacent to Hanover Street, I'm speculating that may be where they met because they after they met up at the parade grounds, they went down Hanover Street. So at least it's a nice speculation. And that would be, let's see, just above what it shows there as the fairgrounds would be where we live, Marie Street, Marie and Kenmore. So Kenmore Avenue didn't exist yet. So the Herald reports that they met up at the parade grounds on the outskirts of the city after an hour and a half travel in their carriages from Wilderness, and the Virginia Herald says, instead of little boys, as Levasseur said, that it was a corps of 40 youths aged 12 to 16, neatly uniformed and armed with pikes, who embodied themselves by the name of the Lafayette Cadets. The Herald also reports that the procession, joined by a numerous body of respectable citizens, advanced down Hanover towards Caroline Street, arriving at the corner of the Farmers Hotel on Caroline Street. They arrived later than had been expected, So they were coming down Hanover Street as the light was fading. I just want to comment on the fact that the paper says a numerous body of respectable citizens. This is from the book on Lafayette, Guest of the Nation. The author is talking about the fact that there, in so many of the towns Lafayette went through, they were so small there were no newspapers. But he happens to give us this census information, and I just want to point that out. If you take a look at this, in 1824, look at that. In Goochland County, there's 3,700 whites and 5,500 slaves. In Albemarle County, there's 8,700 whites and 10,000 slaves. I mean, there are. So the situation is really, the situation of slavery is absolutely unavoidable. I mean, the Lafayette Committee, which met on November 12th of 1824 to plan his visit, issued the following directive to the citizens. Owners of slaves are respectfully solicited to keep their slaves within their lots and not to suffer them to go into any of the streets through which the procession will march on any pretense whatsoever. And all colored persons are warned that they are not to appear in any of the streets through which the procession will pass under the penalty of immediate punishment from those conducting it. So now, back to the procession of respectable citizens down Hanover Street. And here's a map that shows us, again, this is not that old, it's from the 1860s. The Virginia Herald reports, the daylight began to close, and as the procession moved slowly on, darkness was stealing over the scene and began to impair its imposing effect. Without any previous notice or concert, the light beamed from window to window as if by magic, until almost a general illumination lighted its march. Upon arriving at the Farmers Hotel, can you see the Farmers Hotel on here? It's at it's at Hanover and Caroline. Hanover and Caroline. I think that's it there. I can't. Yeah. It's a bit blurry there. Farmers Hotel. Upon arriving at the Farmers Hotel, suddenly the adjacent houses on both sides of the street were beautifully and tastefully illuminated, and the effect was as gratifying as unexpected. The paper also says, quote, a beautiful and appropriate transparency of Lafayette with features correctly delineated, which is interesting. I mean, were people putting up unfaithful pictures of Lafayette? I don't know. Displayed in front of the home of H. Marshall, Esquire, which must have been in the 800 block of Caroline Street, showing an angel over his head and Liberty by his side, with Welcome Lafayette coming from the trumpet on which she blew. The procession paused to appreciate it. There were whispered sounds of applause, and then they moved on to Town Hall. So that's kind of a fascinating little line. Beautiful and appropriate transparency of Lafayette. I don't even know quite what to imagine that was. But it was beautiful and appropriate. So that's always good. Now, in the Lafayette Committee's plan for the visit, because they had detailed plans, the instructions were for the procession to go down Hanover Street to Caroline, then, quote, wheel to the left, proceed to Henderson's Corner, which must be the intersection of William and Caroline, wheel to the left, proceed to Princess Anne Street, wheel to the left again, and come to a stop in front of the town hall. And then the members of the military who were in the procession took up their position in front of the town hall, extending a line from each flank to the sides of the platform, with the Lafayette cadets in the center, their white uniforms neatly trimmed with red, gleaming spears, and a handsome banner adding greatly to the interesting scene. The general was conducted through the lines to the platform, where he was addressed by the mayor. So the newspaper doesn't explicitly say this, I guess, but I mean, I would have thought they would have done this in Market Square, where you have plenty of space. But apparently they didn't. Apparently they did it on Princess Anne Street, which may have meant closing down the street in order to put up a platform so that they could have all these military people there. And then after the ceremony, the committee's instructions are as follows, quote, "The general and his suite will then be conducted to his carriage, and the procession will resume and proceed to escort him down Princess Anne Street to the Masonic Hall, thence to the Main Street, and thence up Main Street to his lodgings." And as you can see from the map, well, you can't because I didn't photograph the whole thing. Caroline Street was also called Main Street at the time. And William Street was also called Commerce. Here's an extended quote from what the mayor said when Lafayette at this ceremony. I think I may have this here. Oh, this is where the Farmers Hotel was. This building was built in 1890. It was Athens Hotel. If you walk around behind it now, you can still see the word Athens Hotel painted on the back of it. But I went in the other day to Latitudes and asked them if they knew when this building was from. And woman there texted the owner, and the owner texted her back right away and said it was built in 1890. But this is where the Farmers Hotel was, across the street from Sammy T's, when he was here. This is one of the things that the mayor, and I had not looked up to see who the mayor was. I'm sorry, don't have that. He said, "The presence of the friend and companion of Washington excites the tenderest emotions and associations among a people whose town enjoys the distinguished honor of having been the residence of the father of his country during the days of his childhood and youth. Our limited population and facilities will not admit of a splendid reception of our generous benefactor. We cannot vie with our sister cities in the erection of triumphal arches, the display of military parades and other magnificent exhibitions, but in feelings of unmingled gratitude and love toward your venerable person, we cannot yield to any." And I just love this passage because, for one thing, he mentions sister cities, which is a total non sequitur. But I'm the president of the Sister City Association, so for him to mention sister cities, this is great. But it's funny that he mentions that we don't have the means to put up a triumphal arch, because just the day before, Lafayette was out in the woods at Unionville, east of Orange, at a triumphal arch, and the people at Orange could put together a triumphal arch. I mean, I don't know what it was made of or how long it stood, but it's just funny that. Here's what Lafayette said back to him. "At this place, sir, which recalls to our recollection several among the most honorable names of the Revolutionary War, I did many years ago salute the first residence of our paternal chief, received the blessing of his venerated mother and of his dear sister, your own respected parent. Here now, as at Mount Vernon, we are left to mourn for departed friends and parents." And then, this is a painting that's in the Virginiana room on the wall. I was looking for maps, and I turned around and I was leaving the room, and I saw this. This is from the 1850s, I think. And so I photographed this. This shows you, you can see the Renwick Courthouse. You can see Town Hall. Right, the Renwick Courthouse here, the arches of Town Hall here. So this is where the Farmer Hotel would have been, right behind the Renwick, because that's just it's at that intersection. So you can't tell anything from this picture about it, but that's where it would have been. So in response to the mayor's comment about not erecting a triumphal arch, Lafayette responded, "An immense Washington monument has already been erected on the whole basis of American independence." Now, he does not mean the Washington Monument up in Washington, because they didn't even start talking about building that for another 10 years. So when he says an immense Washington monument has already been erected, we have to stop and ask ourselves, what is he talking about? Indeed, to our own revolution, we may proudly ascribe the emancipation of those vast and new Southern republics, in behalf of which, at every step of my progress through the United States, I have found the unanimous spirit of the people most warmly interested. Can you follow what he's saying there? I'm going to talk about this. So, you know, what he's when he says an immense Washington monument, what I think he means is he's saying the American Revolution was a world historical event. It really was a world historical event. And after the Revolutionary War, you know, Lafayette went back to France in 1784. The French Revolution erupted in 1789. His role in it was pretty important, complicated. And along with Jefferson, who was there at the time, he drafted the early version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was adopted by the National Assembly in 1789. And that document so emphatically insists upon the equality of all men before the law as a natural right that it inspired the slave uprising in Haiti in 1791. And women's rights were claimed by some at the time as well. Nicholas Condorcet, a well-known writer and thinker at the time, introduced the call for women's rights at the National Assembly in 1790. And he said, "He who votes against the rights of another, whatever the religion, color, or sex of that other, has henceforth abjured his own." And it did not pass. But Condorcet wrote and published a pamphlet called The Influence of the American Revolution Upon Europe in 1786, before the French Revolution began, and he dedicated it to Lafayette. In 1791, Olympe de Gouges published the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, based on this document that Lafayette had written. She died 2 years later on the guillotine. So that's what I think he has in mind, Lafayette, when he said our own revolution. He's not referring to the American Revolution. He's saying the American Revolution inspired the French Revolution, and the French Revolution was so emphatic about equality that it has given rise to these events like the revolution in Haiti. And as he goes on and says, he mentions those new and vast Southern republics, in behalf of which at every step of my progress through the United States, I have found the unanimous spirit of the people most warmly interested. He's talking about South America, which we don't even think of anymore. But look at this. Bolivar and his allies defeated the Spanish in New Granada in 1819. Venezuela and Panama in 1821, Ecuador in 1822, Peru in 1824. This is 1824. Lafayette's talking in 1824, and he's saying what's happening in South America is because of what happened here and because of what happened in France. And he's insisting that, you know, the world is moving to democracy, to freedom, to equality. And he's saying that's the immense Washington Monument. That's what he's referring to when he says back to the mayor, the immense Washington Monument has already been erected. And Bolivar died in 1830. I don't know if the citizens of Fredericksburg knew what he was talking about when he said those things. I have no idea. I mean, what kind of access to information about world political events did they have in 1824? I don't have any idea. So I don't know if they knew what he was talking about at all. But it is clear from every page of Levasseur's account of Lafayette in America, the issues of freedom and equality were really on his mind all the time. Following these speeches, Lafayette and others went into the town hall, which had, quote, been decorated with evergreens and flowers by the ladies with their own hands in a style of simplicity and neatness which reflects as much upon their zeal and industry as upon their taste. A choir of little girls sang a 4-verse song that had been written for the occasion. And then, this slide, after remaining some short time in the town hall, the general and his suite returned to their carriages and conducted them around by the Masonic Hall into Caroline Street and up to his apartments in the spacious building of Mr. James Ross, who had, in a manner which does much honor to his zeal and generosity, surrendered his house and furniture to the corporation for the occasion. These apartments had been embellished and furnished in a style of the utmost neatness and comfort, under the direction of the ladies and with the assistance of the committee appointed for that purpose. Do you happen to know where the home of Mr. James Ross was? Right here. 1201 Caroline Street. This is one photograph before it was torn down. It was torn down in 1809. 1909. This is the home when it was serving as a public school, and it was. So James Ross was a successful businessman. He took the property over from Fielding Lewis's father, who had bought the property, and he built this home in 1800. And apparently, it was the largest building in Fredericksburg when Lafayette was here, and he turned it over basically to the Lafayette committee so that Lafayette could be lodged here. This is when it was a public school. It went from being a private home to a women's seminary, I believe, and then to a boarding house, and then to a public school. And then in 1909, it was torn down, and this building was built as the new public school. And if you go outside and look, that you'll see that the cornerstone says that out there in 1909. There's a whole paper about this building. You have it in that Google Drive. There's a whole paper about the Ross House, also called the Union House. And one of the authors of that paper, I read that paper. One of the authors of that paper is James Harrison III. Any of you know James Harrison III? He works for the Monroe Museum now. He's the Monroe interpreter. He plays Monroe. He'll play Monroe at our ball when we have the ball. And the lecture and this evening, right? Yeah, he'll be here this evening. So he's one of the authors. He was a Mary Washington student in historic preservation and wrote this paper about the Ross House and about the excavation of the land and the building of the new building for the public school, which became the library. Now, I don't know for sure if Lafayette slept here, though, because they refer to this as his lodgings, and yet the Virginia Herald says here in the part about November 20th, sleeps at Farmer's Hotel. And on the next page, November 21st, again, sleeps at Farmer's Hotel. So we don't know. I mean, he had the biggest, the nicest house in the city was set aside by the owner of it for him to have dinner in and have rest in, and yet the Virginia Herald says he slept at the Farmer's Hotel. So I don't know where he actually slept, but I will mention this too. The Virginia Herald account of the church service at St. George's the next day says that when it ended, he was conducted to his apartments, which echoes the language used to refer to the Ross House. And interestingly, the account says he declined to return by carriage, but insisted on walking in the procession, quote, an additional gratification to the anxious multitude who with eager gaze followed the procession to get a near look at him. Right, okay, about 9 o'clock, the party retired from the dinner at the Ross House, from the dinner table, and the general and his suite, accompanied by the mayor and Colonel Mercer, were conducted to the Farmer's Hotel to partake of a very splendid ball, which wanted nothing that expense could procure or taste could embellish to make complete. It was attended by an overflowing company from all the adjoining counties, and seldom has an occasion been graced by so much beauty or engaged with such decent festivity. And if that's what you're going to look forward to on November 23rd. At 11 o'clock, the general retired to his lodgings. Again, it says lodgings. It doesn't, he was in the Farmer's Hotel for the ball, but he retired to his lodgings. Makes it sound like he left the Farmer's Hotel. And the ball ended at 12 o'clock. We're not going to go from 9 to 12. We're going to go from 6 to 9. And my concluding remarks are just that that ball will take place. We will be holding that ball November 23rd. We have, with help from the Regency Society of Virginia and the Rappahannock Colonial Heritage Society, we've got an experienced dance caller lined up to lead the attendees through a series of dances in English country dance style. Elaine Sturgeon of the Rappahannock Colonial Heritage Society will be offering a series of free dance lessons during September and October for people who want to come and learn how to do those dances. And in fact, we have this room reserved on November 14th and 18th for dance lessons. You don't have to dance. You can just come and watch other people dance. That's fine too. In addition, we have contracted with some music historians from George Mason and from Williamsburg who know the music of the period. And they were just thrilled that somebody wanted to hear the music of the 1820s. They were like, yes, somebody wants to hear the music of the 1820s. So they're going to be coming, and they're putting together an ensemble of musicians who play period instruments and play the period music. They'll be performing during the Saturday morning reenactment at Market Square, where Lafayette will be, the reception will be reenacted, as well as during the evening of the ball. And if you come to the lecture on May 2nd here, two of them will be here to talk about the music of Lafayette's time and to do some demonstration of some of the instruments and the music from the period. The ball is the only event of the commemoration that is ticketed. Tickets aren't going to go on sale till September. And I do have to admit, it's not only a key part of the commemoration, but it's a fundraiser for the Fredericksburg Sister City Association. And without fundraisers, we can't do what we do. So we have to charge for it. and as part of the fundraising, we will also be selling these mugs, which Scarlett Pons has made, and Christmas ornaments at the ball, and as well as some of these lectures, if I can get down here to do that.
Can we give Scarlett a shout out for creating our logo for our whole
Scarlett did that too. She created, this is the logo, right? Yeah, this is the whole logo for the commemoration as well. Yeah, and so we really have enjoyed working with Scarlett Pons for doing this. So sorry, I went on a bit longer than I should have. Thank you. If you have any questions you want to ask, I'll be glad to try to answer them.